My name is Alexandra Zamatello, and I will be presenting my submission for the Simulink project or Simulink project competition. For my project, I modeled the endocrine system for a type 1 diabetic. Before I jump into the model, just some background for context. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder where your body registers the cells responsible for making insulin as foreign and therefore a threat. So essentially the type 1 diabetic's body destroys its own ability to generate insulin. And insulin is the hormone responsible for the transport of glucose from the bloodstream to the cells. So it's actually like the hormone responsible for the calories that you ingest turning into energy to power the rest of your body. So because insulin is so important, the treatment for type 1 diabetes is the administration of a synthetic insulin or a pharmaceutical insulin. And because it's not regulated by your body, so for a type 1 diabetic, you're at an increased risk of hyperglycemia, which is my blood glucose is too high because I didn't inject enough insulin, or hypoglycemia, my glucose is too low because I injected too much insulin. So both of those, so hypoglycemia, your sugars being too low, primarily impacts your brain because your brain does not require insulin. Your brain cells do not require insulin to get glucose from your bloodstream. It's based on a gradient. So if the gradient isn't severe enough between your brain and the blood running through your brain, there won't be enough glucose going to your brain cells, and eventually you'll pass out. And eventually, if it's not intervened, you will unfortunately die. Hyperglycemia is there's not enough insulin to take a sufficient amount of glucose out of the blood. And what ends up happening is your blood will become slightly acidic, and it'll essentially like chemically burn your entire body that way. So insulin is definitely the primary hormone in the type 1 diabetic conversation. But what I did is I added epinephrine to an existing model to make it more accurate, right? So some background on modeling, there's two different common models for the endocrine system. There's a minimal model and a maximal model. So the minimal model is essentially, traditionally, it's just glucose and insulin, and then you understand that relationship. The maximal model is kind of going into more of like an artificial patient kind of setup. And obviously both of those have their limitations, right? Because the minimal model grossly oversimplifies that. So you're not getting a very accurate approximation of the system you're trying to look at. And a maximal model is monumentally cumbersome from a mathematical perspective. So today I'm going to present two models because I did this project in two stages. The first stage I did in undergrad, and essentially what I did was I added epinephrine to a model that already existed, and I put them in MATLAB or Simulink, I'm sorry. And I'll show you a couple limitations with that, but from a time perspective, we didn't have enough to address that before the project submission date. So what I ended up doing is that this semester was my first semester in my master's program at Georgia Tech, and I went back and improved those shortcomings of the initial model. Both of them were represented in MATLAB, and then the second one, the one that I did this semester, has an associated script, and I'll get into the differences later. But so the math behind the models are a system of differential equations, one for the glucose, one for insulin. And essentially what ends up happening is you have a couple different components, right? So obviously the common sense one is that you have blood glucose coming from the food that you eat. What some people don't know is that there's a component of that blood glucose that gets stored in your liver as glycogen, and it can always be reverted back to glucose. So there is a component that comes from your liver. Now the glucose out components come from your cells, essentially. So there's non-insulin dependent cells like your muscle cells. Most of your cells are insulin dependent. But non-insulin dependent cells would be like your brain cell that operates on that gradient that we were talking about. This piece, this light green piece, is the novel part that I ended up adding to the model. And it's essentially just a function that describes the effects of epinephrine. So epinephrine is your body's attempt to bring you back from hypoglycemia. So if your blood sugars are too low, and that cutoff ends up being 70. So if I read my blood glucose and it comes back as 70, anything below that will start, my body will start to counteract that with epinephrine. The opposite of that is down here with this theta value. That's the body's way of counteracting hyperglycemia. So if I end up having blood glucose above, I believe it's 250 or 270, I'll start to lose glucose in my urine. And that's essentially just the changes in glucose. The insulin equations are much more simple. Basically, it just has a destruction rate and a production rate. And for a type 1 diabetic, the production rate is related to the pharmacokinetic behavior of the brand of insulin. So this is the big picture of the model. Obviously, there's a bunch of subsystems, which we'll get into in a second. But this is the glucose input corner. So this 8,400 milligrams per hour, is what the glucose contribution from the liver generally is, and that's pretty constant for type 1 diabetics and healthy people. The glucose contribution from meals, I'll open that up in a second, but that is essentially just how I incorporated meals into the model. The epinephrine contribution is the novel piece, which I'll get into in a second. But essentially all of these are summed up and put right into the differential equation. This is the actual math part. There's a couple like unit conversions here relating to capacitance. And then it kind of just goes into the output. The glucose loss in your urine, as I mentioned before, it's dependent on the actual glucose level. So that's why it ends up being stemmed from after this calculation, right? So again, if your blood sugars are too high, it is above 250, right? If it's too high, you'll end up starting to lose that in your urine. And that's why it's read from after, and it comes back into a negative port into this equation because you're losing it over time. Conversely, the epinephrine value ends up being if your blood sugars are too low. So again, that input or that factor ends up coming from after that calculation of your blood glucose level. So that feedback ends up coming back to here. And if your sugars are too low, this will kick on and then it'll go to added glucose into the rest of the equation. This piece down here is a piece that was added because it's something that you can play with, and it's something that I want to play with, but right now I've essentially coded it out. So everyone has, like, very few people are 100% insulin sensitive, right? So type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes, is severe insulin insensitivity, right? Where my body is less responsive to the quantity of insulin in my body. So essentially what ends up happening is if you find out how that person responds to insulin, you can change this factor here and it'll change their responsiveness in the model. But as of right now, for this project, this purpose, it's been put into the model, but essentially it's been nullified by this one being here. We're assuming that the patient is 100% insulin responsive. And then lastly, this is the insulin input. They're modeled as a series of injections. And for the first rendition of the model, this was only for Humulin, which is a brand of insulin. So because this first stage was me adding the epinephrine, I wanted to go into this a little bit. So as I said, the cutoff for hypoglycemia is 70. It registers as 0.7 because of the units required, but traditionally it's 70. And then it's essentially a switch, right? So if my sugars are above 70, I don't need the effects of epinephrine. My body's fine with it. So if it's above, it just goes to 0 and then comes out. Nothing happens. If it's below 70, it ends up feeding through to this side of the switch, which is the math that was already, I didn't come up with this equation. This was in a paper already. But I added it to the model. And then there's just a couple of unit conversions to get it back to the units for this model. But essentially that's the math behind that. So there was a unit conversion initially. Again, that equation existed well before I added it to the model. There is some kind of base epinephrine value, and then there's a unit conversion after that. So that went into, again, as a reminder, that I went into the glucose added section. So a couple other of those subsystems that I was talking about was, this is the carbs from the meal. So I essentially registered it as a pulse function, which is not 100% accurate because that's essentially equating the meal to a constant carb intake converting to glucose. So yes, it's a constant carb intake, or there is some carb intake from the meal, but it's not directly, it's not immediately transferred to glucose. So that is definitely a room for improvement in this model. Insulin injections, there's 4 of them in our initial model. Again, it's only for Humulin. And essentially because I ran this model over a 24-hour period starting at midnight, ending at 11:59, this delay is just essentially corresponding to the time that the injection was taken. So there's one at midnight, one at 7 a.m., one at about noon, and one at about 5:30. The last part, this is what these little insulin injections actually look like. So here's the injection, here's the time. If you open the injection, this is what it looks like. So when I say that this was only for Humulin, the difference is these values here, the bioavailability, the volume of distribution, and then the absorption and excretion constants. So what ends up happening is for different brands, these values will change, and that just affects the behavior of the insulin in your body. Yeah, so that's what all of those subsystems look like. So if you run the model, plugging in a variety of different, or essentially the optimal blood glucose concentration, and or like the carbs in from the meal, and then the optimal injection for that response, this is the graph that you get. So I've put on here that the healthy range, or the range that patients are usually encouraged to try to stay between by endocrinologists, is about 70 to around 170. And you can see that this model ends up going above 70 and below 70. So this area up here, these 3 peaks, would end up being considered hyperglycemic, sorry. And then all of these troughs down here would be considered hypoglycemic. So there's a couple of reasons why that might be. But going into this, this is what the insulin looks like. So that was the graph of the blood glucose in the body. This is the graph of the insulin concentration in the body. So you can see that there are 3 distinct, or there's 4 distinct peaks because there were 4 injections. And the peaks correspond to meal times, right? So we said about 8 a.m. breakfast, about noon lunch, and about 6 p.m. dinner. But the magnitudes are not the same. There's also an overlap between, so this one kind of shows you exactly what the behavior of each injection does, right? So it trails back to 0 over time. All of these 3 do the same, but in the time that it would take it to trail off, you've taken another injection. So the actual magnitude of this injection is lower than the 22 it looks like, because it's being added to the tail of the first injection. But it's important to note that all of these trend back to 0. And that's important because that's where a lot of these limitations in this graph came from, because as a non-type 1 diabetic, we have a base level of insulin running in our body. And then to compensate for that for a type 1 diabetic, to avoid these super drastic increases and decreases in blood glucose, endocrinologists usually provide a prescription for long-term insulin. So this model was limited largely based off of this graph because it wasn't an accurate, healthy, like it didn't output at its optimal behavior. It didn't output the behavior of a healthy patient, right? Because it went higher and lower than we wanted it to. So this semester, we ended up making changes to this model, right? So we still have the same 3 meals. We still have the same injections. We ended up getting rid of the one at midnight and replacing it with a long-acting insulin. So instead of there being that short little blurb right here, we replaced it with a long-acting insulin, which I'll show you in a second. But the big thing that we ended up changing is we changed these to variables, which is important because it ends up allowing you to use code to tailor the model to an individual patient. So what we ended up doing is we asked the patient in a pop-up window, what brand of short-term insulin and what brand of long-term insulin do you use? And we listed the ones that we have data for. And all of that data was found on the FDA websites for those drugs, except for Humulin, which was from an undergraduate lecture. So essentially all of that data, you can see changes with the brands. Same for the long term. Those were all found on their FDA website. And all of them have different bioavailabilities, volume of distribution, and then absorption and excretion constants. So what that ended up doing is it allowed us to tailor the model to the individual patient. And then another thing we did was we added the opportunity for the patient to input how much carbs or how many carbs they ended up, or I'm sorry, how much insulin they had at breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack, and then long term. So we ended up running that and we found that this was our outcome, which was incredible to see because we ended up having much more healthy results, right? So we're within that range, and the peaks and like the changes in magnitude are much more comfortable. So this shoot up right here would likely make the patient feel a little tired because it's a straight, pretty severe increase. But before, with the rise and the fall and the rise and the fall, that would make them feel like garbage all day. So this would be much more accurate in terms of what would make the patient feel better. And then you can see that this is the response to, this is the insulin graph, right? So this is the concentration of insulin. And you can see that the base dose starts at 10 now instead of 0. So this is the long-term behavior. No, they haven't taken a short-term injection yet. So this is showing you that the trend in the long-term, the basal dose is about 10 for most of the day. And because it is an injection like the rest of them, it does tail off, and that's why they have to take another dose at, the next midnight. So what ends up happening is it tails off, but you can still see that at the end of the day, there's still about 70 or 80 units of insulin in their body. And then there's still 3 different magnitudes. It still overlaps, so that's still the same. But the big difference here is that the base dose is not 0 anymore. They have some background insulin acting on their body. So what was really interesting was the validation, right? So my boyfriend is a type 1 diabetic, and he uses a sensor with an associated app that tracks his glucose behavior throughout the day. This graph here was our results from our updated model. This graph here was his average glucose behavior throughout, I believe, a 90-day period. I think it's a 90-day average. I'm not 100% sure. But what ends up happening is I lined up the axes to be the same, and you can see that our approximation falls really almost entirely within these green bars here are the healthy range. It falls almost entirely within the healthy range, but it definitely falls within what a normal type 1 diabetic's blood glucose is. And then obviously I put these pictures here. These are just screenshots of single days behavior, just to represent the fact that more of like a justification of the reason that I wanted to make this product was because all of this red is the potential for my boyfriend to have passed out from too little blood glucose. And all of these up here, these peaks above 250 are generally dangerous for organ health. So, but the big thing to notice here is that this is a pretty good day where he was in the green for a long time, or for a majority of the day. This is probably a pretty bad day where he felt pretty not great for almost the entire workday. And this, I would imagine, felt pretty terrible. But beyond just how it feels, there's definitely a need for type 1 diabetics to avoid these peaks and troughs like that. And then just a part 2 validation, super quick. This is our results from the updated model compared to the original model. And you can see, like I said, the best difference, or the difference we were really looking for, was getting rid of these peaks and troughs. And then we wanted it to come up from 50 units, or 50, the blood glucose of 50. And we did see that. So that was really cool. So this model's not done. I'm going to continue working on it. So what's my end goal? My end goal is essentially an application that a type 1 diabetic can use in conjunction, obviously, with advice from a medical professional, but an app that they can use to tell them how much insulin they should take and when they should take it with respect to a meal. So what components have to go to that? So that optimization has to be added, right? So a code to hold a certain something constant. So I think the easiest way to do it was say, like, hey, it's 9 a.m. I know for a fact I'm going to go to McDonald's and eat a quarter pounder for lunch, a large fry, and a Diet Coke. I can put that carb load into the app at 9 a.m. and it'll say, all right, well, if you're planning on eating that at noon, take insulin, take this many units at, say, 11:30, and then that should keep your glucose between 70 and 170. The second part is that that optimization, first of all, can be added to the Simulink model. I'm confident. The second component that I want to add is some kind of learning component. So ideally, this will be an app that people can use regularly throughout the day, and it can essentially almost learn their behavior, right, in a way that it can adjust for the individual person. So I'm personally not 100%, I guess, not 100% prepared academically to add that yet, but that's something I want to look at down the line. But other components that I want to just add to the model to make sure they're more accurate is the effects of exercise, the effects of like a diet, like caloric restriction as a diet plan, and potentially adding more brands to the model. So that was my presentation. I really hope that you all enjoyed it, because I really have enjoyed making it. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity.